Hello A2, so welcome to your next issue and debate, which is nature versus nurture. The most important thing I would say about nature versus nurture is not to confuse it with determinism. Determinism acknowledges both nature and nurture, so nature through biological determinism and nurture through environmental determinism, but the key thing about determinism is that if you have this certain behaviour or you have this certain quality, then that will guarantee that if you have this certain quality particularly, that will guarantee that you will display this certain psychological behaviour. So that's more about cause and effect and saying that every behaviour has a cause and effect, whereas nature versus nurture is about, is it nature or is it nurture? Determinism is, do we have a choice or not? Nature and nurture is essentially both are deterministic. It's not quite that simple, because you'll look and you'll see that they acknowledge elements of both within it, but ultimately the nature or the nurture debate, whichever side you take, is deterministic. What I want you to take from that, though, is not to combine the two together. You are only talking about determinism, or you're only talking about nature versus nurture. So determinism, was our behaviour due to our free will, or was it caused by a factor of some sort? Nature is our behaviour caused by nature, nurture is our behaviour caused by our nurture. Right, so just bear that in mind. And just so you can have a quick glance, you've done gender and cultural bias already. You have just done free will and determinism, and now you're onto the nature-nurture debate. So you need to be able to talk about hereditary and environment and the interactionist approach. So we've touched on the interactionist approach before, but now you have to know it for nature versus nurture. However, it's always one that we're going to use, so you will become confident and familiar with it. And they're an example of some of the questions. What is meant by the nature-nurture debate? Referring to the statement, discuss the nature-nurture debate. So you could get a 16 marker on any of the issues and debates. And then there's an example here of pheno and genotype, so a smaller one, so it could be within research methods as well. Okay, so nature, or you could call somebody who believes in the nature debate, side of the debate, a nativist, believe that all of our behaviours are influenced by innate factors, and innate just means inborn factors, so facts, everything we're born with. Any behaviour that we are going to have, we're born with, preloaded with that behaviour in some way. It may not display itself for many years' time, until biological maturation occurs, till we mature physically and biologically, but it's all innate within us. Okay, and that applies to the idea of heritability, which is the idea of passing on physical or psychological characteristics, so either the way that we look or the way that we act, the way we behave, the way we think, genetically from one generation to the other. So you all know about heritability related to diseases, so you can inherit different diseases, and it's the same with psychological characteristics as well, both, if we use the psychological terms, both typical and abnormal, so both normal and abnormal, and we've talked about the term abnormal before. One example of looking at a heritable behaviour is schizophrenia with MZ twins. So a lot of the research done by people in the nature-nurture debate is based on twin studies, because, as you know, it helps us pull apart whether the characteristic is more due to nature or whether the characteristic is more due to nurture. So a quick recap from the biological approach, and I'm trying to make life as easy as possible by not introducing too many new concepts where I don't have to, and we're relying on other areas of the spec, and the more you can make those links, the better. So looking at the biological approach, you've got concordance rate, so that's the likelihood that if one twin displays a disease or a characteristic of any sort, it doesn't have to be a disease, then the likelihood that the other twin will display that condition as well. MZ twins, monozygotic twins, are from the same egg. They share 100% of their DNA and 100% of their environment. Diazygotic twins are from two eggs, so they share 50% of their genes and 100% of their environment, assuming both of the twins are raised together rather than apart. We're not looking at twins that are separated, although that is research that can be done as well. So the only difference between MZ and DZ twins is the amount of DNA they share. So the bigger the concordance rate, the bigger in the difference of a concordance rate between an MZ and a DZ twin, the more likely that it is due to nature. The smaller the difference, the more likely it's due to nurture. And if you still, that's a brief recap of the biological. If you're struggling, please go look over your notes or have a look at the Flip Learning video as well, to refresh your memory on concordance rates. And then we've just got an example here of schizophrenia, and Fisher's very famous research that we've previously looked at found that there was a 50% concordance rate for MZ twins and a 15% concordance rate for DZ twins. So that shows quite a strong genetic influence, because it's quite a big difference between the MZ and the DZ twins. So if you have an MZ twin who has schizophrenia, you have a 50% likelihood that you would also display schizophrenic traits or might be diagnosed with schizophrenia. If you're a DZ twin, if your twin has schizophrenia, you are 15% likely to also display schizophrenic traits. More recent research done in 2004 found that it is 40% for MZ and 7% for DZ. So actually the percentages overall are lower. However, the difference between the two is still quite big, so it does still suggest it's due to nature. At this point, the focus is on AO1, so you'd just be describing. However, later on you could consider in the AO3 that, of course, 50% still isn't 100%. So it suggests that whilst nature does have a strong part to play, there is still a huge environmental factor as well. Okay. Another example of how you might inherit your behaviour, another example of the nature side of the debate, is the evolutionary approach. And you've already covered both of these things before. Bowlby in lots of detail with Andy, and briefly we touched on sexual selection as well. So Bowlby believed that attachment is evolutionary. And if you think back to the evolutionary approach, we've got the idea of the survival of the fittest. So traits that help us survive are adaptive, and they are passed on to future generations. So we evolve to have adaptive traits. People without those adaptive traits die, they don't pass on their genetics, and therefore the gene for not having that adaptive trait dies out as well. So Bowlby thinks that attachment is an adaptive trait, and he believed that attachment helped us survive because if we attach to a primary caregiver when we're young, humans are very, very vulnerable. When they're babies, they can't do anything for themselves, so they need to develop that attachment so that somebody will want to care for them, provide them with food, keep them safe. And it would work the other way around as well. So the caregiver should want to give care because and develop that attachment, because that would help pass on their DNA, which is obviously an adaptive trait as well. So again, if you're not sure, have a quick look over Andy's notes as well. This is an ideal opportunity for you to do a little bit of revision, but still feel like it's worthwhile and related to these second year subjects. So if you've been struggling with that, have a read over the biological approach and have a read over attachment. Other examples as well that you'd have touched on would be imprinting with Lorenz and his goslings as a type of attachment, and that's obviously evolutionary, because if you imprint on the first thing that you see, follow them around, they're more likely to care for you, so it increases your chances of survival. And then we've got Buss, who conducted a piece of research into sexual selection and generally found the types of traits that men and women looked for supported useful mating strategies. So an evolutionary trait in men is to seek out short-term mating relationships, so one-night stands, because that would allow them to pass on as many of their genes as they could. The more women that they can impregnate, the more their genes would survive. Whereas long-term mating would be more suitable to women because they're going to be pregnant, because they have to, and especially if we think about when we had significant process of evolution, so a very, very long time ago, when there wasn't any of the modern conveniences. So for example, when they would be pregnant, and then also when they would breastfeed afterwards, they'd be very vulnerable. They wouldn't be able to go and seek any food or seek any help themselves, or protect themselves in any way. So they would seek out men that would want to stay with them and give them a long-term relationship, because that would improve the chances of survival for themselves and also the chance of survival for their baby, having a long-term relationship, someone who would care for them. So it's an adaptive trait too. So they're just some examples. The whole time you talk about it, though, make sure you link it back to nature. So the idea that it's innate. So therefore, these behaviours would be innate, and our behaviour could be explained by nature. So just keep linking it back. And then the other side of the debate is nurture, or we could call, and we also call them empiricists as well. And of course, you've come across the term empiricist. And if you think about where the biggest focus is, or when psychology first started, where the biggest focus was on looking at directly observable behaviour, which at that time would be observable behaviour. They couldn't necessarily do as much research into innate things such as genes, was the behaviourist approach. And they're always looking for empirical data, and we'll come to those in a minute. So nurture, or empiricists as they're known, and they suggest that all of our behaviour is influenced by our environment. They suggest that we are born as blank slates, tabula rasa, and then every behaviour that we develop and we understand is influenced purely by our environment. And they suggested there's different levels of the environment, all the way from prenatal all the way up to cultural and historical context. So they acknowledged all of the environment. So prenatal, while the babies were still in the womb, it indicated that, so a piece of research conducted found that maternal prenatal distress, so if the mothers were distressed while they were pregnant with the child, that increased the likelihood of health and behavioural difficulties in those children, as well as an increase in cortisol levels and negative emotions as well, or negative emotionality, which just kind of means perhaps not being able to, having quite a negative outlook, so more likely to become depressed, or struggle with aggressive behaviours as well. So the key thing there is health issues, and also issues with different difficulties with behaviour, and also high levels of cortisol. So cortisol, as you know, is linked to stress, and so this stress that is experienced by the mother while the child is inside the mother, I don't know if that's perhaps the right way to put it, but when the mother is pregnant, increases the likelihood that the child will display difficult behaviours. And empiricists, people who believe in the nurture side of the debate, would describe the prenatal environment, the womb, as an environment which has the impact. So they would say that would explain certain behaviours. And then we've also got cultural and historic context. So this one's a little bit trickier to kind of explain or to consider, but it's just the key thing it's demonstrating. It's not just direct environmental stimulus that you experience when you're alive or when you're born. It's before you're born, and it can be as complex as the cultural and the historical context and the cultural and historical environment around you. So if you think there's quite a lot of cultural elements embedded into environmental ones embedded into people's lives. So we touched briefly on, in psychopathology, the fact that more black men were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you could argue that's because they come from a culture historically where they believed that hearing voices was their ancestors talking to them in some black cultures, and so hearing voices was a positive thing. Culturally it was a positive thing. So it can be the cultural context and historic context. So potentially you could argue, although this gets a bit tricky, where the warrior gene that comes from cultures where historically there's been a lot of warfare, so they could argue that was the environmental impact that led to those behaviours. But we'll come back to that as a more suitable point, kind of concept that kind of explains that a little bit more, because that is a little bit more the combination of nature and nurture. In AO1 you really, really clearly want to divide nature and nurture. And then you've got the two examples, of course. So you've got the behaviourist approach, and I've put attachment there, but you could talk about absolutely anything. So also about phobias as well in Little Albert. So the idea that our environment and learning to associate things together would lead to certain behaviours. So if we associate a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned response, then eventually we get a conditioned response. So Little Albert got the conditioned response of fear. So empiricists don't think that's anything to do with genetics, it's all about the environment. And then exactly the same with social learning theory. So we learn aggressive behaviours by observing and imitating those around us. So it's nothing to do with our genes at all. It is all to do with observation and imitation of role models in the environment. So that's all your AO1. Potentially in AO1 you could talk about the interactionist approach, but I think it'd be much more effective if you save that for your evaluation. There's a lot more that you can talk about in your evaluation. So if we have a look at the first one, you've got the N, which is the negative impact of the debate. So if you very much side on one side or the other of the nature-nurture debate, then it can have a very significant negative impact for lots of different reasons. And one of the particular reasons, if you focus purely on the nature side of the debate, so the belief that all of our behaviours are motivated by innate influences, then that can quite easily lead to the idea of eugenics, which is something that the Nazis held a belief in, and it was also a belief that was held in America for a long time as well. So it's a belief that everything was determined by our genes. So not only was that nature, but it would also be biological determinism as well. So they were both nativists, but also biological determinists. So they believed that genes were the only thing that would influence your behaviour. So if you had a low level of intelligence, if you had a child, you would pass on that gene, and there was no way that child could become more intelligent. Or if you had an illness, you would pass on that gene, and there's no way that you could avoid having that illness. So they very much support the idea of selective breeding. So in certain places they advocated, so suggested, that sterilising people with a low level of intelligence, they couldn't have children, would be something that they could do to increase the intelligence of the population. Of course, in Nazis, you've got Hitler, who wanted to create the Aryan race, so therefore he was exterminating all the Jewish and people, but also, as well as that, he targeted or discriminated against gay people. He believed that homosexuality was genetic, and therefore if you killed all gay people, then you wouldn't, when he developed his race moving forward, there wouldn't be any gay people. So if you think about the Aryan race, that's very eugenic. So of course there are massive ethical implications there, which would be a really significant problem as well. A significant problem. And of course, if you link it back, if you think about cultural and gender bias, it's the very same idea. If we, as a psychology, as a science, gets connected to the concept of eugenics, if we're associated with it, people aren't going to want to study that. That's going to impact our ability. The number of people studying psychology, so reduce the number of researchers available, then reduce the research. So any theories won't be based on valid research. It would be a science that would fall into disrepute and wouldn't be very popular. So obviously that would have some serious impacts for us. The other way you can look at it is also through nurture. So if you hold too much of a nurture debate, the belief is that if you just change somebody's environment, you would change a personality within them, and that's been used to control lots of people in lots of different ways. There's two different ones you could talk about here. I think we'll go first with the idea as if you've ever heard of praying the gay away, so gay aversion therapy. So it's a bit like systematic desensitization, but almost the complete opposite at the same time. So somebody who was gay would, and the reason it's called praying the gay away is because it's very much associated with the church. So they would be shown pictures of gay porn, and they would receive electric shocks at the same time. And I think you've done more of that with Andy. So the idea they would measure arousal when you were looking at pictures of naked people of the same sex and of different sexes, and if you showed arousal to someone of the same sex, then again you would be electrocuted as well. And it was the idea of shaping that behaviour so that you no longer displayed it. So as you can see, huge ethical issues with that. There was also, and I don't know if this is something some of you cover in history, but there is the Khmer Rouge regime that was around from 1975 to 1979 in Cambodia, and it's one of the fairly recent kind of modern mass sort of the equivalent of the Holocaust, so mass killings of people. And one of the key things that they did is they wanted to alter people's behaviour, and they wanted them to go back to living rural kind of communal lives, move them away from the city, and that's because they wanted to control them. And a key focus of their campaign was brainwashing through conditioning the children of Cambodia, so that they would just follow orders blindly, and they truly believe that not following the rules was bad, and that they should just blindly accept obedience. And that was all done through conditioning, so training. So behaviour shaping is really, really dangerous. So again, if psychology is connected with or associated with those atrocities, then that's going to impact who wants to study the science, and therefore the kind of people that might want to study it with that reputation. It would very much bias research as well. Now, the next one, there's two ways you could approach it. The research, there's methodological issues, which you'd all be able to do really, really easily, I think, because we've already done this quite a lot, and where we evaluate twin studies. So I'm not going to give you a piece of research, but you're going to evaluate broadly twin studies, because that is something that the nature-nurture debate highly relies upon. That actually isn't that effective. There's some problems with it. There is also another piece of research, epigenetics, which is really fascinating, and if you could talk about it effectively, that would be really, really good. So if you're going for the higher level skills, I'd recommend that you talk about it. However, if you do, I would just swap. I'd have the epigenetics. I'd mention it after the interactionalist approach. So if you're using methodological issues, then you would go negative impact, methodological issues, which is part of the research, interactionalist approach. However, if you decided you were going to do epigenetics, you would do negative impact, interactionalist approach, epigenetics. So it's just a slight tweak there, and hopefully you'll see why that makes sense. You're all very aware of the methodological issues of twin studies and adoption studies, so they aren't particularly useful in helping us to tease apart nature versus nurture, because there's very, very rarely a concordance rate of 100%. So really generally what it tells us is that nature and nurture have an impact on behaviour, but they don't actually really demonstrate truly whether it's nature or whether it's fully whether it's nurture. But the key things to consider here are that we make the assumption that in twin studies that MZ twins and DZ twins, if they're raised together, they all share 100% of their DNA. However, even if they're raised together by the same family and go to the same school, there are some environments which are unshared. So they do have shared environments, but they also have unshared environments as well. They might have different friends, they might have different hobbies. Another really important thing to think about as well is that MZ twins, because they look alike, could be treated more similarly than DZ twins as well. So that would be something about their environment. However, it would look like it was more due to nature than to nurture. So MZ twins would have more of a shared environment than DZ twins would have potentially. But yeah, think about all the different ways. So if you have brothers and sisters in the home, obviously it's not MZ and DZ, but you're being raised in the same environment, but think how you do things quite differently outside of the family home, or even in the family home, you're treated slightly differently. Also, huge issues with generalisability. Twins are very unique. There's a very small number of them, so mostly sample sizes are very small. And they also have, because they are twins as opposed to any other type of family member, that is quite a unique and different experience to other people within the population. So of course that causes issue with population validity, generalisability as well. Okay. There is the interactionalist approach. So the interactionist approach is the idea that it's not just nature and it's not just nurture, it is an interaction between the two of them. And most psychologists now acknowledge that it's not, is it nature or is it nurture, but the question is more, how much is it nature and how much is it nurture? So we're trying to work out where it is on the scale of the debate. So the interactionist approach acknowledges that both sides of the debate have some influence over our behaviour. And it's the same, again, not wanting to confuse you and go back to determinism, but it'd be in the same way it was about determinism, where it wasn't just that all of our behaviours were determined or we had complete free will. We fell somewhere, every kind of behaviour fell somewhere on the spectrum. So there was an element of determinism, but there was also an element of free will as well. And both of these are examples previously from the specification. So again, hopefully it's more about recap than it is about learning brand new concepts. But you've got the diathesis stress model with schizophrenia. So that's the idea, and I'm sure you can all remember my beautiful drawings because we also call it the bucket theory. I wouldn't call it that. I'd try and remember the phrase diathesis stress model. So it's the idea that we generally, if you're born with a genetic propensity, it does make you more likely to develop schizophrenia, but you still need those environmental factors for you to develop schizophrenia. However, you need less environmental factors than somebody who was born with a very, very low genetic propensity for schizophrenia, who would need lots and lots of environmental triggers. They can still develop schizophrenia, but they would need more environmental triggers. And that's the idea. So it's an interaction between the two. So just because you've got the genetic propensity, it doesn't guarantee it. You also need to have some environmental triggers. The amount depends on quite how significantly predisposed you are to schizophrenia, but that amount differs. But you still need a mixture of the two. Then there's neuroplasticity. So of course, nature, you're born with your brain in a certain structure. However, if you think back to Maguire with the taxi drivers, different parts of their brain developed and changed and grew because of their experiences, because they had to learn to navigate and they had to remember different things. So their hippocampus was much bigger than somebody who hadn't had the experiences of a taxi driver. So again, biologically you're born with a certain kind of functioning brain size, and then your environment plays a part as well. So of course the interactionist approach is really suggests that it increases validity, because we can't truly explain any behaviour just by talking about nature or just by talking about nurture. We can explain more behaviours if we acknowledge that both nature and nurture play a part, and our theories focus on working out how much is it nature and how much is it nurture, and increasing the validity, rather than just focusing purely on nature or nurture. Okay. The final bit of research is really interesting, but might take you a little bit of time to wrap your head around. It is something that you are all completely capable of understanding. However, like I say, just bear with it and see what you can understand. Also, there is this information about epigenetics is in the dog book, and I'll also try and remember to put some links on Moodle as well for you. Okay, so epigenetics is the true sort of acknowledgement of the interactionist approach, which is why I suggest to put this research later on. And this is the idea that nature and nurture truly do work together in a really complex and quite interesting way. So we are all born with a certain DNA structure, and that DNA structure cannot be altered. However, I'm sure there's probably some variations to that, but pretty much it's fairly fixed and it can't be altered. So you're born with your certain genes, and that's it. However, on those genes are epigenetic markers, and based on your environment, they can turn off and turn on genes based on the influence from the environment. Okay, so whilst the genes are always there, whether they're turned on, whether they start to work, or how much they work is influenced by our environment around us. So that's the ultimate kind of influence between nature and nurture. And the way that this is really effectively demonstrated is by Diaz and Ressler, who they trained mice by spraying cherry blossom perfume, a cherry blossom scent, and then shocking them. And unsurprisingly, as you know, that's mostly focused on nature. Because of classical conditioning, they developed a fear of the smell of cherry blossoms. They'd run away from it. They'd try and spend as much time as possible not near where the cherry blossom scent was. So far, that's awesome. That's something you're familiar with, and very much lands on the nurture side of the debate. They've associated cherry blossoms with shock, so now they have a conditioned response of fear and running away. However, the next generation of mice then also never exposed to cherry blossom and the shocks. The first time that they were exposed to the cherry blossom on their own would also avoid the cherry blossom. So that was a behaviour that's been passed on through their genes, but it's an environmental experience that the parent mice had. The children display it without any environmental stimulus. So there was clearly in their DNA, there was possibly not a complete gene, but there was a genetic ability to develop a fear of cherry blossom. However, in mice that then aren't exposed to cherry blossom and a negative stimulus, they don't develop any fear of cherry blossoms. However, mice that are exposed to cherry blossom and a negative stimulus, the epigenetic markers start to work, and it turns on that genetic propensity to have a fear of that smell. The mice then breed and they pass on that behaviour. And we're not talking about evolution, because that happens over thousands and thousands of years. We're talking about an immediate next generation. They developed a fear of it with no environmental stimulus or guidance whatsoever. They also conceived mice using the sperm of mice that had been who'd experienced the shocks in the cherry blossom. The mice then didn't live with the parent mice, and they also displayed a fear of the cherry blossoms. So there's obviously been something in their DNA, a switch that's been turned on, that's allowed them to allowed that information to be passed on, the DNA structure and the epigenetic marker, which then allows them to display that behaviour. So it's the ultimate kind of combination of nature and nurture working together. So nature would be the structure of the DNA, and then the nurture would be the environment, and the epigenetic markers is the bit in the middle that kind of interacts, is an interaction between nature and nurture. So that's why. And then obviously that's a piece of research which supports the idea of the interactionist approach, and also increases the validity because we're able to explain more behaviours through both nature and nurture at the same time. So that's why I'd suggest, if you go with the epigenic one, that you would go against the structure that I've previously recommended and have the research at the end. So you still only need 3 evaluation points, and I'd highly recommend that you aim for the epigenic one. However, you can also go for the methodological issues. So final thing, just to recap, and then that'll be it. So if you are using methodological issues, go negative impact to the debate, methodological issues, interactionist approach. If you want to try the epigenetic markers, which I'd recommend, it would be impact of the debate, epigenetic markers, it would be negative impact, interactionist approach, epigenetic markers. It just makes more sense. It's not the end of the world if you don't, but it does then give you less if you talked about the epigenetic markers first, gives you less to talk about in the interactionist approach. Brilliant. Thank you very much.